This week on Jerusalem Dateline, after a year and a half, Israel finally gets a government. But will it last? Plus, for the first time in history, a flight from the UAE lands at Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion Airport. And a new excavation uncovers buildings back to the time of Jesus. And the miracle story of 샬바’. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. After 18 months of political gridlock and 3 inconclusive elections, the power-sharing coalition between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and blue and white leader Benny Gantz finally took office. But it could face its first major test in just weeks when they debate the contentious issue of sovereignty over Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria.
The entire sovereignty issue is in the agenda only because I personally acted to promote it for 3 years, publicly and privately. I discussed it with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo last week.
Netanyahu and Gantz said Israel needed an emergency unity government because of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Frankly, we both would maybe have preferred to form a different government. Maybe it would have been easier, for many reasons, for both of us to go for another round of elections. We both made a difficult decision, but the right decision for the people of Israel.
One thing that could cause gridlock is the former rivals will have veto power over most of each other's decisions. Critics called the government bloated.
After all the empty talk of an emergency government, the government being formed today is the largest and most wasteful in the history of the country. 36 ministers, 16 deputy ministers. You call that an emergency government?
Netanyahu and Gantz agreed to share power where Netanyahu serves as prime minister for 18 months. Then Gantz will take over as prime minister for the next 18 months. Netanyahu's trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust begins on May 24th, but he can still continue to serve as prime minister during his trial. He calls the charges part of a witch hunt. The political marriage between Netanyahu and Gantz includes disagreements about major issues like extending sovereignty over biblical Judea and Samaria and judicial reform. So it remains to be seen how long this fragile coalition can last and what answer they give to the question, how can two walk together unless they be agreed? Complicating matters regarding annexation, Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas announced that the Palestinians voided all agreements with Israel, including the Oslo Accords. That includes canceling all security cooperation with Israel in the West Bank. And the PA rejected President Trump's deal of the century and opposed any annexation of Israeli communities in biblical Judea and Samaria and the Jordan Valley to Israel. Although COVID-19 has wreaked worldwide havoc, positive things are emerging from the pandemic. For example, nations without diplomatic ties are working together to help others. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story.
For the first time, a commercial flight from the United Arab Emirates flew directly to Israel, landing at Ben Gurion Airport. The unmarked Etihad Airlines flight brought 14 tons of humanitarian aid and medical supplies for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. The equipment included personal protective gear and 10 ventilators.
Some remarkable outcomes in terms of advancing Gulf-Israel relations during this pandemic, during the COVID-19 pandemic. Of the 6 Gulf states, 4 of them are now in contact with Israel.
New York Rabbi Mark Schneier has been building relations with Gulf state leaders for more than 12 years. He sees a growing partnership developing.
My conversation with different Gulf leaders who have said to me, Rabbi, with our wealth and resources and Israel's brain trust and technology, in cooperation, we could be the region to find the vaccine, to find the cure.
No Gulf state has formal ties with Israel, although Schneier says Qatar began the process 2 years ago. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also made a rare visit to Oman in 2018, where he met with the Sultan. Around the same time, Miri Regev, Israel's sports and culture minister at the time, visited the UAE for a judo tournament where they played Israel's national anthem, Hatikva. Schneier says common challenges are bringing Israel and certain Gulf states together.
The Iranian threat continues, but now we have the economic threat. This virus had a very negative impact not only on the Israeli economy, but on the Gulf economy. And then there's always the physical threat in terms of keeping your citizens safe.
Schneier says the Gulf states now realize they have a role to play in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process by offering economic incentives to the Palestinians.
We're on that journey to the promised land of Israel-Gulf relations, and I'm confident that it will not take 40 years. And UAE landing its plane at Ben Gurion, bringing humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people is one more benchmark along that journey.
Palestinians later rejected the aid, saying they didn't want to play a part in normalization between Israel and the Gulf states. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, from historic modern milestones, along with its conflicts, to a new discovery in Jerusalem that goes back 2,000 years. Israeli archaeologists have revealed a unique underground system carved into bedrock from the Second Temple period. Again, here's CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl, who takes us to the site.
Even though the Western Wall remains under COVID-19 restrictions, archaeologists are still at work. The latest dig deep underneath the entrance to the Western Wall tunnels uncovered a unique treasure dating back to the time of Jesus. From outside, it looks like a modern white door, but open it up, and it's a gateway to history. Like much of Jerusalem, civilization is built on civilization, even carved into the bedrock.
Most of the buildings that we know from this time period were stone built, were on the street level. And in here we're finding, this really impressive and unique rock cut system.
The rock-cut system from the Second Temple time was completely covered by a Byzantine-era mosaic floor that's part of a monumental public structure built about 1,400 years ago. It was renovated about 150 years later.
Last January, we started to excavate and we started to dismantle the mosaic itself in order to find the earlier remains to this building.
Dr. Barak Manakandam Givon, the site's co-director, says archaeologists noticed a great attention to detail in the subterranean structure.
And those details showed us, the archaeologists, that this system was used on a daily basis. It may be used as a pantry, so people stored their grocery or olive oil or wheat and barley, or what is more possible, that it was used, for daily life. People actually lived here.
The site is also located about half a football field from the Temple Mount and only 40 feet from the huge bridge that connected ancient uptown Jerusalem to the Temple Mount.
Basically, what we have here is a window to the way the women, men, and children of ancient Jerusalem during the time of the temple lived. And we're finding here a very unique way of living that was not really familiar to archaeologists working on this time period or in this area.
Archaeologist Michael Chernin said artifacts from the dig also attest to the history here, like this chalk cup.
The finding of vessels of this kind show us that here in this area there was a Jewish population in this area, because vessels of this kind was used only by the Jewish.
Other finds included the rim of a huge expensive pot like those at the wedding in Cana when Jesus turned the water into wine. The revelation comes on the eve of the Jerusalem Day anniversary, when Israel reunited the city and regained control over the Temple Mount just 53 years ago. Julie Stahl, CBN News, underground near the Western Wall in Jerusalem.
Up next, the miracle story of Shalva, the world's largest facility of its kind. Jerusalem is home to the world's largest facility for the disabled. We talked to its founder, Rabbi Kalman Samuels, about what has become known as the miracle of Shalva. Rabbi Kalman Samuels, we're in Shalva, which is the largest facility of its kind in the world, 220,000 square feet. Tell us, what is Shalva and how did it get to this point?
Shalva means serenity, peace of mind. It's an organization that my wife and I set up many years ago, and its source of that name is biblical. It's Psalms 122, verse 7. May there be peace in your walls, Shalva, serenity, within your palaces. We chose that name because what we desire to do in this organization is to provide serenity and peace of mind for people who don't have it.
And we can hear some of the activity going on right now. This is a place with a lot of life, but it didn't start this way. You have 1,000 people that you service almost every day, but it started with your son, Yossi. Tell us about that.
Our second child, Yossi, at the age of 11 months, was taken by Malki to a public health center to get a routine vaccination. And unbeknown to her and unbeknown to the community, they were having problems with a batch of that vaccine. Yossi was injured, and amongst many others, and he became blind, deaf, and very hyperactive. So our lives got flipped on its head. Well-meaning visitors to my wife often said, you know, you can't manage a household with a child with these disabilities, and you should consider finding another setting for him. And Malki used to cry and say, God, I'm never taking Yossi out of the home, but if you ever decide to help my Yossi, I will dedicate my life to helping other mothers and their children. And 7 years later, we were witness to the Helen Keller miracle, where Yossi got suddenly a breakthrough to communication when a woman in the deaf school spelled the word table in Hebrew letters in the palm of his hand, and he suddenly realized that that was this object. He quickly learned how to spell. He was then taught how to speak Hebrew synthetically, and my dear wife sat me down and said, it's payback time. I made a promise that if God ever helps, I will dedicate my life to other women. God has helped, and I want to set up a center to help these youngsters. It started with 6 children in one garden apartment. Malki ran the programs. By this time I was in the computer field, and we thought it was amazing to be able to serve 6 kids. What we didn't know is that God has a great sense of humor and very different plans. And it kept growing in leaps and in bounds. And today, indeed, we serve over 1,000 people a day from birth all the way to adulthood, and with their families, providing quality of life to them and their families. And as you can hear, this place rocks. It rocks 24/7. So it's not only the biggest physically, it's probably the biggest care center anywhere.
And also Shalva has made world news not long ago. The Shalva band played for Eurovision, where literally hundreds of millions of people saw the Shalva band. Tell us about that.
The goal of all our programs at Shalva is to focus on abilities and not on disabilities, and try to maximize those abilities. Over a decade ago, we began a music program designed to create a band, which we thought would be a nice in-house band. And we took kids with musical ability who were younger, older, and we took a great musical director, and he began to work. What developed was beyond anything we could have imagined. Last year, they were invited to play on Israel's version of America Has Talent, and whereas we thought they might win once, they rocked and they knocked off the competition, and they got to the finals. Having done so, they would have been able to play in Eurovision as contestants, except that the finals fell on the Sabbath. And some of the children are religious kids and they couldn't play. So the whole band decided we're not playing. It was huge news when they withdrew. But then the Eurovision folks came back and said we'd like them to play as guest artists at Eurovision. So they sang A Million Dreams from The Greatest Showman at Eurovision in front of more than 200 million people, and it made waves all through Europe with the BBC and everybody else featuring this band. If anyone would like to see it, the Shalva Band, A Million Dreams on Eurovision. But I warn you, take a piece of Kleenex with you.
Yeah. Final question, Rabbi Samuels. You've written a book called Dreams Never Dreamed. What's the biggest takeaway you want people when they read that book?
I think the biggest takeaway is, with God's help, ordinary people can sometimes do things that are not considered ordinary. We could never have dreamt of this. We're people who tried, who pushed, and we see a blessing that we've been able to build something that we're humbled by what it has become. But it's not about us. It's about every one of us as human beings, that we have to have our dreams, we have to follow our dreams, and with God's help, these dreams can come true.
That's a great message, especially in these days right now, Rabbi.
Oh, are they ever? May God help us all.
Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Up next, Israel celebrates Jerusalem Day and the reunification of the city 53 years ago. "53 years ago, Israel captured the old city of Jerusalem for the first time in more than 2,000 years. On Jerusalem Day, Israel commemorates that history, and we ask Rabbi Yehuda Glick what that event means.
Exactly 53 years ago, Israel established the first unity government. Because we were in danger, that a population of 2.5 million, surrounded by 200 million, were threatening to wipe us from the face of the earth. We were begging the world, we want to survive. Who knew that 2 weeks later, we will be after Israel's greatest victory in history ever. Within 6 days, we returned to the biblical land of Israel, all the mountains of Judea, Samaria, the Golan Heights. We returned to the old city of Jerusalem, and the city is liberated and reunited. It's the word of God coming out of the book, materializing and becoming a reality in our times in front of our eyes.
The capture of Jerusalem's Temple Mount 53 years ago sent shockwaves throughout the Jewish world. It also raised hopes for the building of the Third Temple. On June 7, 1967, Israeli Brigade Commander Mothe Gur made an announcement the Jews had waited to hear for some 2,000 years.
The Six-Day War was a miracle of biblical proportions and was a cataclysmic opening of a new era for Israel and for the whole world.
Rabbi Chaim Richman of the Temple Institute is dedicated to rebuilding the Jewish temple. He sees the time since the Six-Day War as a prophetic shift.
It would be hard, I think, not to see what's happened in the past 50 years as a tremendous jumpstart, a tremendous fast forward. It's more than prophetic. It's like a kiss from heaven, you know, it's like a divine kiss. It's an intimate brush with the reality of God's compassion and love, and He keeps His promises.
The Institute shares a key connection to the battle for Jerusalem. Its founder, Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, served with the 55th Paratrooper Brigade that captured the Temple Mount. After the victory, a Jordanian guide gave them a remarkable tour.
His job was to carry the company machine gun. There's a very beautiful photograph of that. He actually, the first night of the liberation of Jerusalem, he was given the task of guarding over the spot of the Dome of the Rock, which of course we believe is the Holy of Holies. The story, though, that he told us is that the soldiers were on the Temple Mount, and it was just like the first hour or so. And they were approached by a Jordanian fellow in Western dress who explained that he was the official tour guide for the Jordanian parliament, and he offered to take the soldiers and show them the sights on the Temple Mount. And he takes the soldiers, you know, the rabbi there, and he says, well, this is exactly where the sanctuary stood. This is where the altar stood, and then this is where the menorah stood. He tells them all these things about the history of the Holy Temple. Finally, the rabbi asked him, why are you telling us all this? And he said, well, we have a tradition from our fathers, they from their fathers, that one day the Jews would wage a war and conquer this mountain and rebuild the Holy Temple. And I assume that you're starting tomorrow. And I want this to be my part in helping you.
What was their reaction to that story?
Well, gosh, I guess yes, they were pretty surprised, but the bottom line is, in hindsight, it doesn't look like we were ready.
Richmond sees the temple through the eyes of the prophet Isaiah, who wrote 3,000 years ago that God's house would be a house of prayer for all nations.
It means basically that there's a God in the world and that the best is yet to come, and that we are so connected to Him and to each other and to that purpose and to all humanity. And it's just a wonderful privilege to be here with you today, to be looking out over Jerusalem and to realize that we're living in probably the most important time in history.
Up next, sounds of the 샬바 band playing Hallelujah. Thanks for joining us. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. We'll leave you with the 샬바 band playing Hallelujah, along with well-known Israeli singer Kobi Marimi. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.